Are you comfortable? The prelude today is Blue Boat Home by the choirs and musicians of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville, Jason Sheldon directing.
Your camera was covered.
Okay, I know. Okay, I started. Can you fix it here? Oh.
Well, there have been several choirs.
No licking.
Welcome to the third Wednesday service of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council, UUMUAC for short, or shorter than that, UMIAC, sometimes even called the MAC. I'm Richard Trudeau. I'm a semi-retired UU minister living in Massachusetts. I'm also this year the chair of UMIAC. Tonight, as you've seen, the sermon is called UU's Clamor to Embrace Trojan Horse, and our preacher is the Reverend Jack Reich. Jack Reich is the former minister of the Unitarian Society Los Angeles West. He's now happily retired in DeKalb, Illinois, whose lovely mountains can be seen behind his head when he shows us his head. He's on the membership committee of UMIAC. He's a member of the board and the membership coordinator of the UU Humanist Association. He's a founding member of UUs for Jewish Awareness, and he's a founding member of the NUTS. That's NUUTS, stands for the Non-UU theological school graduates. And I will endeavor to light a chalice. Oh, first, before I light the chalice, I'll get this right eventually. I wanted to talk about next month's service. The third Wednesday in April is April 20th. And our preacher will be the Reverend Craig Morrow, who was our preacher back in October. And his sermon title is Enduring the Ridiculous. And he's talking about the stuff that's been going on in UU circles now for the last 5 years. If you got the Zoom link for this service from that email address, richard3point@gmail.com, you'll automatically get one for that service unless you opt out. If the link was forwarded to you by someone else, then you should send an email to that address to get on the list. Our past services, all of them now, are on YouTube. And the way to see one is to just go to youtube.com, and there's a search box at the top of the page, and type Third Wednesday UMIAC services. And you'll get all of the services since the first one in July. These little bings you're hearing are people coming into our time here together. Now I'll light the chalice. We enter this hour as people of faith, having sorrows and joys, needs and gifts. We'd like this beacon of hope as a sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. It is the mission of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council, UMIAC for short, to carry out and foster anti-racist and multiracial unity activities, both within and outside the Unitarian Universalist Association, through education, bearing witness, and other actions, and expansion of our membership, both within and outside the walls of our congregations. We also seek to defend our UU principles against those who seek to undermine them. We envision our congregations, denomination, and society as not being color blind, but color appreciative, as judging and treating members of the world's rank and file by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their cultural heritage, and as treasuring diversity in the context of the beloved community. We call this vision multiracial Unitarian Universalism. This is the prize on which we try to keep our eyes. This is the goal. This is the mountaintop, the unity of light and dark-skinned people of the world. This is the point when in previous services, there was often a prayer or meditation. And I asked Jack what he'd like to do. And he said, a silent meditation is nice. So yes, let's do that. Let us be silent together for a minute or so to create an opportunity for prayer or meditation. Our opening hymn is Gather the Spirit. The singers are the chancellor choir of the First Unitarian Church in Oakland. And please sing along, but please stay muted. The Zoom technology can't stand even two voices at the same time. I think now Jack has a reading. Jack, where are you? Oh, Jack, you're muted. Jack, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I thought I had unmuted. Just goes to show you. Those are the words of Jim Scott, one of our beloved UU songwriters. My reading tonight is from a blog post entitled The UU Crisis Explained, posted in 2019 by blogger Mel Harkrader Pine. He wrote, in June 2017, when I heard a moderator of the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly call Robert's Rules of Order an instrument of, quote, white supremacy culture, unquote, and thus unfair, I thought it was one of the most absurd things I had ever heard. I still think so. But now I understand the mindset that leads to statements like that. Critical race theory holds that racism and white supremacy and sexism, etc., are not comprised entirely of individual acts by racists and supremacists, but are endemic to American culture. We're told that white supremacy is part of the US DNA, built into everything in our laws, literature, norms, and so forth, for the benefit of white people of European descent, especially if they're men, and it can't be fixed by simply stopping overt acts of racism and white supremacy. The system needs to be rebuilt. White people, especially men, can help only by getting out of the way and encouraging other whites to get out of the way. Here's a quote from the textbook Critical Race Theory, 3rd edition. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. In other words, critical race theory rejects the liberal Enlightenment concepts that gave birth to modern Unitarianism and Universalism. So if your parish minister attended seminary in the last 15 or 20 years, she or he or they is likely to have a much more narrow view of UUism than ministers trained earlier. As UU ministers age and retire, they'll be replaced by the newer breed. That's why I think more congregations will experience the crisis many are not yet aware of. In the meantime, get ready to be told that disagreement is injury. Books can be condemned by people who haven't read them. People can be condemned for expressing hurtful ideas. Those of us who don't meet the accepted definition of marginalized should be silent to leave more room for the marginalized. The UU Ministers Association can define the meaning of responsible in the 4th principle about a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The UU principles and sources need to be examined and revised in favor of something more covenantal. We who are white need to be careful not to welcome persons of color too warmly into our congregations, lest they think our means white, a microaggression. The UU hymnals need to be scoured for any references that might not be all-inclusive enough, such as standing on the side of love, because that harms people who can't stand. If we don't like something, it's part of the white supremacy culture. We all need to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, even though it makes sweeping generalizations not backed by any research. And we should not bother reading books like The Gadfly Papers by Reverend Todd Eckloff and The Self-Confessed White Supremacy Culture by Dr. Ann Larson Schneider, because some people's feelings might be hurt. Richard?
A little music again. This is by the Nashville Bunch again. We won't sing along, we'll just listen.
From the fire, living in the fire, go back to the fire, turn the world around. world around. Bodies of the river, body is the mountain, spirit is the sunlight, turn the world around. We are of the spirit, truly of the spirit, holding and the spirit, turn the world around and wow. So is the life of the wow. So is the life of wow. So is the life of the wow. So is the life of wow. So is the life of the wow. So is the life of wow. So is the life of the wow. So is the life of
Jack?
In Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid, the story is told of the Greek triumph over the city of Troy after a long, unsuccessful military campaign. Anybody remember how long? I'll tell you. Troy had formidable walls, and the Greeks, unable to breach them, built a large wooden horse in which they hid about 30 fully armed warriors. Then they sailed away. They left behind a single volunteer who explained to the Trojans that the horse was a peace offering in atonement for the Greeks' desecration of Athena's temple at Troy during the 10-year siege, meant to ensure them a successful voyage home. There was among the Trojans a skeptical priest named Laocoon, who guessed the intent of the Greeks and warned in Virgil's famous line, "I fear Greeks, even those bearing gifts." But before he could persuade any fellow Trojans to his view, the god Poseidon sent a sea serpent to kill him and his 2 sons. Just being on the wrong side could be costly in those days. And so the Trojans joyously wheeled the gift horse into their city. And you know the rest. In the night, the warriors crept out from the belly of the beast, signaled their comrades to sail back, and sacked the city of Troy. Many of us learned the outlines of this story, if not the details, as students in high school. Why do we still study fictional poetry more than 2,000 years old? Because these masterpieces alert us to timeless inclinations of humankind, which can be disastrous, and which we ignore only at our grave peril. Can you think of some other people who are endangered right now only because they're on the wrong side? Otherwise, our teachers wouldn't bother with them. There are far too many things which we must learn and too little time to learn them. Protecting ourselves against ill-intended plots must certainly rank among the most important. Now, I am not one of those who believes, as some of us do, that racial bigotry is at bottom an economic malaise, one foisted upon the working classes by the manipulative rich in order to pit workers against one another and so gain continuing superiority in the battle for precious resources. Rather, I believe with sociologists and psychologists like Gordon Allport that the nature of prejudice is that it is a feature of human existence, born and bred into every race and tribe, and which can only be eliminated by deliberate and difficult effort at reshaping human character. That it has found its way into the weaponry of the wealthy to ensure subjugation of the poorer classes is an unfortunate accident of history, and one which has cast its pall over our civilization and continues to sicken and weaken us to this day. Spare me just a moment to argue my view. Why do people fear and even hate outsiders? because in the early formative years of our race, we could never be sure of the motives of strangers who might want to lead a raiding party to rob and kill members of our tribe. And so we learned as youngsters to recognize members of our group and fear others so that we would close ranks against strangers and protect ourselves. As humanity matured and various human groups grew in size, these fears of others grew as well, so that people who were recognizably different were shunned. As the traditions of warfare were incorporated into the spreading human culture, it became permissible to capture outgroup members and force them into slavery. And this became a normal part of our cultural landscape, so that the custom is even recognized and permitted in that landmark foundation stone of Western culture, the Bible. Over time, doubts about the wisdom and fairness of this particular habit grew, so that by the end of the Middle Ages, there was growing resistance to the idea that anyone could be justly enslaved. And little by little, the doubters grew to equal or outnumber the proponents of slavery. We are all familiar with the terrible cost that argument levied upon citizens of the United States, who finally could not solve their disagreement except by war, the bloodiest in our history. One side won that war, but the problem is they did not banish prejudice and bigotry from the human heart. And although the initial decades after our Civil War saw great strides in the liberation of the former slaves, the nation soon backslid into habits of oppressing the Africans among us and depriving them of rights the rest of us had come to expect, such as being able to vote and hold office and live without fear of being lynched. The nation settled into a long period of racial injustice. Unitarians and Universalists have often been in the forefront of the fight for racial justice, but they have also often been numbered among the oppressors because we participated in the evolving culture of our nation, some holding more liberal, some holding more conservative views. Even our ministers were divided on these questions, as I'm sure you know, some favoring abolition, some accepting slavery. And yet, slowly we moved toward adopting abolitionist views as the country itself moved decisively away from the acceptance of slavery. There is little that can rival the claim of racial justice on our consciences. Today, we understand with a certainty far greater than we ever possessed before that any form of discrimination against a group because they are different from the majority is simply wrong, and that we must struggle to eliminate it from our polity. We have not always been perfect in our response, but we have usually stood head and shoulders above everybody else. And this is the hallmark of human progress, is it not? That over time, we become more like the people we know we ought to be, and less like those we abjure. Even today, there is bigotry and prejudice amongst us. This can hardly be denied, yet it is not a signal that we are steeped in bigotry and unredeemable. Not so long ago, our president, the Reverend Frederick Reich, held up a detestable message sent to a religious educator at one of our congregations, dripping with language of racial animus, and said, in effect, you see, white supremacy culture is alive and well among us and needs to be opposed. I was stunned because this otherwise intelligent woman had in fact proved no such thing. What she had demonstrated was that there was at least one UU in one congregation who surrendered to impulses of racial bigotry. But that doesn't mean white supremacy culture is alive and well amongst us, or that we maintain and support it. No group of people anywhere is perfect. We overcome by making common cause with like-minded others, not by shaming, scapegoating, and infantilizing. But the eighth principle projects a whole network of panels to ride herd on our fealty to our covenant. These are to be panels of BIPOC marginalized people who can best determine whether or not they have been victimized by white supremacy culture. And where there are not enough such members of a given congregation to form such a panel, why, the congregation will answer to a panel of outsiders. Do we really want to have to answer to people who are not part of our community and basically know nothing about us? Because we can't be trusted to undertake the work of racial reconciliation without a panel of overseers? Because we cannot be trusted to do what we say? And whose business is that anyway? And how exactly does this reflect a culture of beloved community? So how does this whole movement reflect an embrace of a Trojan horse by the UUA? Because the eighth principle, put forward almost 10 years ago by two, count them, two UUs, calls for congregations to be accountable in their dismantling of white supremacy, which includes decentering whiteness. Now you tell me, in a denomination whose history has been almost totally made by white people, and which is overwhelmingly white today, how are you going to decenter whiteness? And why would you want to? These are the people who created the denomination others are said to be eager to join. We need to decide, what is our most important objective? Is it to make our congregations pure with regard to the dismantling of white supremacy? Or is it to grow and expand, enlarging our congregations and founding new ones? Are we more interested in pursuing racial justice to the exclusion of everything else, or in fulfilling our long-term goal of growing and becoming an ever more influential force in American life? Now, if following the eighth principle's creator's blueprint for healing racial harm was a genuine recipe for harmony and growth in our congregations, who could complain? But it is not. I don't know how you feel, but I don't need and won't accept some star chamber panel of heretofore marginalized persons who may not even have any prior connection to my congregation to tell me when I'm breaking my promises. This assumes that UUs have no working consciences and can't be trusted to know when they are harming minorities and when they're not. What do you think? We don't listen? Can't listen? Won't listen? If you wanted to discourage membership growth, could you come up with a more effective plan? This eighth principle is a Trojan horse because after an almost 10-year siege, its creators have urged congregations to vote for it if they're truly anti-racist and take it into their communities where unelected panels of marginalized folk can then claim the right to oversee the congregation's process of decentering whiteness and dismantling white supremacy. According to what standards, by the way? The ridiculous article by Jones and Oken, which suggests punctuality and writing things down are hallmarks of white supremacy? You know, there are real racial problems in this country that need to be addressed. But this Trojan horse tackles none of them, leaving our minority communities as disadvantaged as they have ever been. The eighth principle uses language that suggests its motive is love and the creation of beloved communities. Let me ask you something. Do you feel loved when you're told to stop leading, get out of the way, and let marginalized persons tell us what we must do to set things right? Is this attempted takeover of our congregations by groups of disaffected BIPOC supposed to give us confidence that the process is going to eventuate in the flourishing of beloved communities across the land? Are you kidding me? What are the criteria by which congregations will be judged on whether they have kept their promises? And oh yes, by the way, what promises? This little detail is never specified. Noted UU author Jonathan Tweet, a member of this group and of University Unitarian in Seattle, described in an online forum how the congregation discussed the eighth principle before voting. Opponents or doubters were assured they'd have their say. But when they asked for the same privileges people in favor of the principle received, holding open group discussions, putting out printed statements to the congregation, having a chance to relate their concerns at congregational meetings, they were denied. And this reflects similar treatment of dissidents at other UU congregations. The prevailing line on opposing the eighth principle seems to be basically shut up or get out. How should UUs treat one another in these ongoing discussions of the eighth principle, now taking place in many places around the continent? If we're really about creating the beloved community, so emphasized by the eighth principle proponents, wouldn't you expect there would be a determined effort to give everyone their say, to encourage them to get their concerns out, to give them a fair hearing, to try to understand all points of view? But alas, that's not what's happening. Instead, opponents of the eighth principle are being systematically silenced and vilified as racist or worse. Is this the kind of UU community you ache to be part of? How will congregations be treated by these panels of marginalized anti-racists who are proposing to sit in judgment on the rest of us? You know, sometimes when you preach, you have to call an audible at the line of scrimmage. And I'm going to eliminate a 6.5-minute video that I had queued up to play for you because the sermon is going on longer than I expected. But I'll tell you in 30 seconds what it's about. Leslie Mack, 5 years ago, who eventually became a vice moderator of the UUA and a member of the board of directors, delivered a rancid, vulgar attack on a well-known blogger because he dared to try to have a conversation with her about these matters, and attributed to him many things which he had not said and did not mean. And I suggest to you, this was not some random Black UU. This was Leslie Mack, one of the founders of Blue, and later a vice moderator of the UUA and a board member. What were Mel's sins? He disagreed with others in his congregation over disinvesting in South Africa. Big deal, so did I. She scolds him about believing anything you want, which he has never advocated. He had the gall to be offended when 2 lesbians were treated badly. He has no right to want to feel safe in church. And he lives in Loudoun County where there were racist incidents. Plenty of other UUs live there, by the way. We have a UU congregation there. And he wrote a litany which she mocks with no basis whatsoever. So perhaps this is what we can expect when panels of heretofore marginalized, and if Ms. McFadden is any gauge, angry people sit in judgment on our congregations and our anti-racism work. How is that for creating the beloved community? Attacking another UU for daring to tell his own story his way. Casting contempt at him because he happens to live in a rich county, where, by the way, he has worked for racial inclusiveness, not acknowledged by Ms. McFadden. Characterizing his attempt to have his say as fuck shit behavior, and promising that as a white UU, he can forget about being comfortable in his choice of the UU congregation, because minorities have often not been comfortable, and now the tables will be turned. She followed this up, by the way, by telling the then coordinator of the worship web, who is now our UUA executive director, that Pine was cool with racism, so that this fellow, with no investigation whatsoever, removed from the worship web the litany that Mel Pine wrote that had been there for about 20 years, creating the beloved community. The eighth principle is a Trojan horse, posing as a gift, but brimming with mistrust and a desire for vengeance. And just as with the original, many recipients of this gift have rushed to embrace it with alacrity. it may yet prove their undoing. And by the way, note that it has gained adoption by 155 congregations out of 1,000 in 8 years. So that leaves 845 congregations which have not adopted it. Not exactly a thunderous show of support, is it? Now, let me add that we may be equally skeptical of the COIC report. The eighth principle and the COIC report were authored by different people in different contexts, but their thrust is the same: to remedy the historical reality of prejudice with direct action. The problem is, the remedy is so far off from the problem. The COIC took testimony from hundreds of UUs of color. Hundreds. We're supposed to have 250,000 UUs. They took testimony from hundreds. But the question they asked was not, what has been the overall nature of your treatment by your fellow UUs, but rather, with the promise of confidentiality, tell us about your ill treatment by white UUs. This is ridiculous on its face, yet has been treated with utmost seriousness by the COIC. Of course, they're going to get negative responses. They asked for them. And they have now sealed them for 5 years. You can read the COIC's summary, but not the actual responses. And just take a moment to consider what the commission was named. Not the Commission on Institutional Health, not the Commission on Securing a Powerful Future. No, the Commission on Institutional Change. Kind of gives the game away before the first pitch, don't you think? In our service last month, Rick Hoyt McDaniels pointed out that we are a truth-seeking religion and liberal because we are free. Free from many elements that bind other religions, including a dominating hierarchy. We might well ask, if we adopt this eighth principle, already affirmed in many congregations without anything resembling free discussion, and rejecting expressions of disagreement, will we still be a liberal religion? Will we still be seekers after truth, respecting individual views? If we lose liberalism, he says, we lose who we are. And I would add, if we have a bamboozled General Assembly adopt a principle dictated from the top down, are we going to remain a Unitarian Universalist association? Let's ask Todd Eckloff, or Kate Rody, or Rick Davis. Now, I've emphasized a few aspects of the eighth principle. This has not been intended to be a definitive catalog of its flaws, which has been done elsewhere by others much more completely. And the eighth principle is not even a principle. The drafter should have consulted a dictionary first. Principles are short, pithy statements of conviction which structures of belief and action can be built upon. They are not whole programs of social action. Here are the principles which our congregations agree to promote. 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Those are our principles. A few years ago at General Assembly, we emphatically rejected an attempt to revise them. Several of them bear directly upon the question of the role of minorities within our association and the manner in which the majority ought to treat them. And they do so more powerfully, more accountably than the so-called eighth principle, journeying toward wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. How about other principles, which might include, say, number 9, to oppose the dominance of American economy by exploitative capitalism, or 10, to put into practice those environmental actions which will preserve life on Earth, or 11, to press for an overhaul of America's manifestly unjust criminal justice system, 12, to revamp our healthcare system so that all are accountably cared for, 13, to advocate for adequate funding and training for America's teachers, 14, to revamp our broadcast landscape so that every point of view can be adequately represented, 15, to undo the exploitation of Native American resources that deprives them of their rightful inheritance. None of these is trivial, and all are overdue. We can do with no fewer than 15 principles, and the sooner the better. But where does it end? Is this the path we want to go down? Pretty soon, no one of us will remember which is a principle of ours and which a plank from some political party's platform. Like many UUs, I am often dismayed by the execrable state of race relations in this country and the failure of our association to remedy them as powerfully and intentionally as we ought. But let us not make a principle out of every social action program we might want to endorse. We already have principles that cover just about every program we may feel we need. Indeed, that so-called 8th principle might make a great addition to our purposes, minus that devil word accountably. But let's not start stuffing our principles with what are in fact social action programs. I suggest to you that we already have wording in our purposes and principles to motivate us to new heights of UU achievement. Quote, grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith. We are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. Amen. Ashe. And blessed be. May it be so.
Thank you, Jack. We don't have an actual offering, but we would like you to look us over. We are the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council. We are briefly Unitarian Universalists organized to promote multiracial unity.
Yeah, I am.
Who are
I turned off because I was shutting my eyes.
could you please mute yourselves? Somebody's, yeah, thank you. To our horror, it seems to us that the biggest obstacle to multiracial unity, excuse me, at least among UU congregations and UU institutions, the biggest obstacle to multiracial unity is the anti-racist ideology that has captured the minds of a majority of national UU officials at the UUA and in the UU Ministers Association and in both seminaries. And so we find that if we really want to work for multiracial unity, we're forced to opposing this this ideology. And to me, I guess the proof that the ideology is incorrect, besides my own thinking about racial issues, is the leaders, the national officials, are sacrificing Unitarian Universalism itself in order to push their agenda. They're sacrificing our most fundamental values, Enlightenment values, free thought, free expression, open debate, discussion. This is being sacrifice. This is proof that they're on a wrong path. Look us over, visit our website. We have a periodical called The Arrow. There are many issues there. There are lots of interesting articles there. Think us over, think us over. And now, this is our closing hymn. And this is again by, let me think, this is the group in Oakland. And I invite you to sing along. I'll put the words on the screen.
Amen.
For closing words, I have chosen a passage of words attributed to Kalidasa. Be ye lamps unto yourselves. Be your own confidence. Hold to the truth within yourselves as to the only lamp. After which we extinguish the chalice. Richard will do the honors.
I'm doing the extinguishing.
With Elizabeth Sully Jones reading in our hymnal, we now end our service these words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Amen.
Amen.
And now we don't have a coffee hour. We just sort of hang around and talk for a while until we run out of gas. I'd like you to please, if you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand feature at the very bottom of your screen. If you move the cursor to the bottom of the screen, there's a little thing that says raise hand. And if you do that, the Zoom technology will not only put a little yellow hand in your window, but move your window right to the front so I can call on people in order. And it looks like I have a hand up already by Finley Campbell. Go ahead, Finley.
Who's speaking?
You are.
Oh, I am speaking. My wife is, what are you telling me? I'm supposed to be talking. All right, thank you. Brother Jack, you knocked it out the ballpark.
Thank you.
And you made it very clear based upon the historical experience that not only you, but others in this room have shared as we have watched the evolution of the creation of this great Trojan horse. And a Trojan horse it is. It's an attempt once again to destroy the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations that many of us have devoted our lives and our honor to trying to keep going forward. I just came from a hearing, as usual, and because I had used the power of the pew, I had asked the minister, could I respond? He gave a long harangue about white privilege. He connected white privilege to white supremacy, and then he connected that to the January 6th insurrection and a riot. And with my heart pounding, my flesh alive with fire, I went down and courteously asked him, could I have a permission to give a 3-minute rebuttal to a 20-minute sermon? And of course, he had the freedom of the pulpit. He could either say yes or no, but he said no. And then since it was Black History Month, I put on my civil disobedient hat and went up and gave a talk anyway, pointing out that white privilege is a universal imperative in a desegregated culture no longer existed. There may be elements here and elements there, but it had been destroyed. Well, some of the neo-racist members got into a snit, and so I just came fresh out of the hearing, and we worked out hopefully a point of view. But there was one person there, he didn't want to let it go. He said, you harmed the church. I said, really? The whole church got harmed because I got up there and spoke out against the white privilege thesis? He spoke 20 minutes, I spoke 3. Where's the harm? Well, the harm was you broke up the coffee hour. You made the coffee hour feel controversial. I said, well, that's what civil disobedience does, is to make people uncomfortable particularly when there's some negative thing being put forward. So after a great deal of discussion, we came up with a plan in which I would not do that again, and I'm not going to do it again, but they created some ways for me to be. I've been banned, by the way, since a couple of years ago to speak about racism in any capacity. But now a little open door has opened up. They said, well, if only you just sit at a table and people just come by and sit and drink some coffee, then you can talk about multiracial Unitarian Universalism. So this is hard work at our congregation. All these were good friends, except there's one guy, he didn't want to let it go. And it's because he was speaking ideologically. He said, anybody who says that white working class people, professionals, and students are hurt by anti-Black racism, that is a wrong voice and shouldn't be heard in our church. So there you go.
Thank you. Yes, Judith.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the sermon. I want to tell you that I'm from a very tiny congregation in far northwestern Wisconsin. So we clearly are one of those that is going to be subjected to outside tribunals or whatever they are. And surely these services have told me things that I kind of knew were going on, but not in so much detail. So I really appreciate them. But I have a question. It seems to me that the service talked a lot about what is happening and what is being done. My question is why? Jack, you talked about how they are undermining, I may not have the words quite right, the foundations of Unitarian Universalism to advance a political program. So I'd like to know your thoughts on why are they doing this?
It's a very good
I
question.
think we've discussed that yet.
It's a very good question, Judith. You know, I think the short answer is this. Many people of conscience and goodwill are motivated to attack what they see as social ills and change the conditions that produce them. But many on both the left and the right come to feel that their point of view is the only one that has any validity because they believe it with such commitment, such ferocity. And therefore, they attack people who disagree with them. And that's what's going on in our denomination today. Imagine a guy like Todd Eckloff, a minister who has spent literally his entire career pursuing social justice and opposing the oppression of various groups of people, being called on the carpet by 500 white fellow ministers and by a couple of black racial organizations within the UUA for writing what really is quite an interesting book about how the UUA is falling victim to some of the forces afflicting the larger society and eventually being literally drummed out of the ministry by the Ministerial Fellowship Committee for basically for writing a book. The Unitarian minister. This is unimaginable to me. This is crazy. But this is what's going on, Judith, because there are people who won't accept other people disagreeing with them. And they don't see it's like what Jesus talked about, mote beam projection. They see the mote in another's eye, but not the beam in their own. I hope that answers your question.
Well, be interested in hearing other views on this as well.
Yes, indeed.
Well, we have three people with hands up. Maybe they would comment on this. Finley, go ahead.
I take this, first of all, let me be very clear. I'm a Marxist, Leninist, historical theist, Unitarian Universalist, Baptist ordained minister with a big mouth. Now that's out the way. I think you ought to understand in 1961, when we were founded, we were cutting loose from the 2,000-year tradition of monotheism. And while the word humanism and social humanism does not appear in our documents, because we don't want to be too identified with the Humanist Manifesto, nevertheless, we represented a breakthrough in 1961. Now, take your minds back to the 60s. There's a guy named J. Edgar Hoover who is monitoring all kinds of potential dangers to the United States of America. And on his desk, according to someone who saw it, I didn't see it myself, there was a statement that said race mixing equals communism. And one of the reasons that his FBI never intervened fully in trying to stop the racial violence that was going on, including the bombing of the church, lynchings, the killing of Sister Loizo and all those folks, is because he saw this as a deadly danger to the American way of life and to US imperialism. Now, I'm not going to say he sat down and said, oh, these UUs are coming together to form this new phenomenon. But think about it. We were going to apply all of the liturgy and ministers and church structure and hymn singing and the emotional energy of the 2,000-year monotheistic tradition in a humanist framework, a social humanist framework. And when we went down to Alabama, the whole board of trustees, they tell me, went down to a march, in the big march at the Pettus Bridge and beyond, March to Montgomery. The word went out through the FBI phenomenon, we got to do something to break this up. And they couldn't directly unleash the Ku Klux Klan anymore. And they couldn't directly use federal intervention through the FBI because Johnson was already committed to desegregating the American society. So in 1963, during the Great March on Washington, he met with members of a Afrocentric neo-racist group called Freedom Now. They met in his office, and they committed themselves to building an anti-integration, anti-desegregation movement. And sure enough, 1966, right in the height of the move from desegregation to racial integration, here comes the Black Power movement. And what's the first thing it does? It kicks out the white people in SNCC. It begins to argue, we don't want to be a part of this system anymore. And I would argue that from then on in, our commitment to the seventh principle, the fourth principle, and the first principle has been a stone in the eyes of very powerful people who do not wish to see this denomination do what it could have done, be the open house for the moral and spiritual transformation of people who love their religious background, but didn't want to give it up totally by becoming people who looked at television on Sunday and had a cup of coffee and watched somebody over WBEZ or something like that. We were a threat. I know it's hard for us to believe it, but think about it. We were on the picket line of freedom for almost 100 years.
Thank you, Finley. Dick.
Yeah, there's another aspect that people often cite about the question that was asked earlier. And that is simply that there's a lot of white guilt out there. And especially as these things, as people study more about the history, we got beyond the 60s and what become standard and was no longer standard. People saw what was going on in the past and felt they still needed to do something about it. But the only thing that was sort of avant-garde, sort of new, was this stuff coming out of postmodernism, critical race theory that was actually had all these very strong kind of, I would say, even totalitarian fascist elements in it. These things are very, the new philosophy at that time was very anti-enlightenment. It was very strongly opposed to our principles. And so and because people, I think, wanted to do something about race and these kinds of things, they said, oh, here's this new ideology and it's different. It must be right because some Black people say it's right. Everyone else was ignored, of course, like Finley. And so a lot of people jump on board to get on a bandwagon. But in addition, as Jack did point out, we've got all these other problems in the world that aren't being solved, that we could be solving. Why are we spending all this time on race, which is a minor issue compared to global warming and global inequality, global population, all kinds of things like that? Why aren't we looking at the global economic system, globalization? And this just happens to serve some very powerful elite purposes. If we're dividing ourselves over race, we're not concerning ourselves about global capitalism or the global geopolitics like we should. And we're paying a price for it right now in the Ukraine when we don't pay attention to these things. So we get distracted by more fundamental, the tribalistic things. It's like Jack said, it's kind of in our blood, these kind of things. They're easy to exploit on both sides. And so I think we need to look at that bigger picture, the white guilt and how it's being exploited to focus on race, not on class, not on the economy, not on any of these global problems, which is very, very disturbing to me.
Thank you, Dick. Kate. Kate Rohde, your hand is up. Your camera's not on, but your hand is up.
Okay. I'm having a little trouble
There we go.
manipulating this here.
Yeah.
Well, I think UUs are known for jumping on liberal bandwagons because we're theologically weak and uneducated. We are not very well educated in the Enlightenment values that underlie Unitarian Universalism. I mean, I think we're attracted to that, especially people of our age and our generation. I notice there is a certain generation represented here. That we, and most of us, I think if you talk to most UUs, they were attracted to, this free thought and expression and all that sort of thing. So, if you look, if I've been a minister since the late 70s, and know that UUA has always had one fad or another fad that they've gotten into, as opposed to really, drilling down on the basics of who we're about and helping us develop and go deep. The problem is now they've glommed onto a very authoritarian ideology, and for the first time, they want to impose their fad on the entire all of our churches and our seminaries. And so they're basically dismantling our core belief system. They're going against our 500-year history. So I think and that's happening all over. I mean, just look at a much younger organization like the ACLU, which, and I guess it was the 1920s, was founded for free speech for everybody. And then about 2-3 years ago, it's now only for free speech of the people we like. And you look at the universities and you see people getting thrown out and their jobs being, even people with tenure are losing their jobs because they run afoul of this new ideology that seems to have institutional capture of a lot of leftish and liberal institutions like universities, like NGOs of various sorts. Even now this elementary and high schools are there's some institutional capture going on there. And it's because, I think, as Jack says, they come in a sneaky way. They say, oh, we're for all these liberal ideas, but they aren't really, because they're for them in a totalitarian way, the way Lenin was, or Stalin was, or Mao was. In the 30s in our country, a lot of civil rights folks were communists because the communists spoke a good game on racial freedom. And but once they caught on to Stalin, they thought the better of it. And that you can't really have liberation in a totalitarian system. But all these young people don't know enough about history. They know almost nothing about the history of free speech and free expression, and why that's a good thing, and why every liberation figure we can think of has been strongly for that. I mean, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King to Cornel West to all the early feminists. They were all very adamant about this, this kind of intellectual freedom, because minorities, King said, without free speech, the civil rights movement could not have existed. And if you want to look at what white supremacy culture is, the most suppressive culture we've ever had in the United States was during slavery, where you could be thrown in jail and even get the death penalty for advocating abolition. And you hear about you saying, oh, they shouldn't say that because they might hurt somebody's feelings. First person to ever say that about not hurting someone's feelings, that was our friend John Calhoun, who said, well, we don't want to hurt the slaveholders' feelings by allowing abolitionists. So it's, these kinds of arguments have been used since the Greeks, but people don't know their history. They don't know the philosophy of liberalism well enough not to, rush to this new Trojan horse.
Thank you, Kate. Pat Moore. You're muted. You're muted.
I'm almost embarrassed to talk because I don't have any ministerial credentials.
That's all right.
I've been a UU though since 1973, and I used to be a GA junkie until they took the theistic turn. I almost feel like what's happened here. I feel like I've been ambushed, you guys. I didn't until I read about Todd. I had no idea about the crap that was going on. And then that really opened my eyes. And since then, I've immersed myself in it. I'm president of my congregation right now, but we've just barely started even education on these. My profession used to be an education researcher, though, and I wanted to call your attention to something that relates to this question, which is, how did we get here? Why are the people doing this? Why are they leading you down this path? I just finished reading a book by a conservative, John McWhorter, called Woke Racism. And his explanation for the reason this has happened, and not just, we're in the middle of it, we're in the center, but it's happening everywhere, like Kate says, it's happening in government offices everywhere. He says it's because it's a religion, and you can't fight a religion with reason or evidence or history or anything else. These people really feel like they have the moral high ground. So that's why this stuff is it's right at home in religion, because it's a religious thing. You're not allowed to question it. It's like being in a Christian church and questioning the existence of Jesus Christ. You cannot get on that moral high ground unless you're there with them. And I feel like they're, this woke racism. By the way, what McWhorter calls these people are the elect. And he said, you cannot question the elect. If you do, you're a heretic and you're going to be thrown out of the club. And that's exactly what I see happening. It cracks me up that I hear this when I was looking at that report the other day, which is very difficult. Anyway, the thing about we want a liberation theology, that's the most laughable phrase I've ever heard applied to this. This is not liberation. It's anything, but it's not liberation. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Nancy.
Yeah, just to respond more to you, Pat, that what I'm calling it now is that instead of having religion at my church, we're having politics, ultra-left politics, and I'm a moderate. And that's my spiel now is I think people can understand that, if your minister is speaking politics and you don't have the same politics, there'd be a reason why you'd be angry about it. So that's my approach right now.
Thank you. David, you're muted.
Yes, so this is my first time on this side. I appreciate what's being presented. I want to let you know two things that I'm taking to deal with the situation down here in Florida. And number one is that I got on our safety committee because there is a big fear of retribution because of social justice, and we're going out and we're in the news. So I'm of value to some extent because I'm a FOIA monitor once or twice a month. And so that's a plus for the fellowship. Now, I guess I could get axed at any time. But the second thing I'm doing, just like you folks, we're coming out of COVID and we're starting to meet in person again. And I'm going to be putting together an art and craft discussion group. Hopefully that doesn't get real political, but that's going to be most for us retired baby boomers. It'll be like a daytime group, but we have to increase our membership. I don't know about you folks out there, but we were almost 300. And after some politics in that, we're down to 160. And so I think we need to build ourselves up. I have a cousin in Chicago and she says her North Shore place is increasing, but for some reason down here it's decreasing. Well, I'm just not going to sit on my butt. I'm going to try to do something. And I've been a group facilitator for 30 years as a social worker, so I know the mechanics of it. But I'm doing those two things, as well as I've read the books and I've talked to Jay Siskel and that. And I'm a moderate like the other lady, or like the lady said. But it's, so I'm taking the stuff with a grain of salt. So that's my 2 bits.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen.
That's him.
Hey,
Oh,
okay.
Rod.
Yes, it's Rod. It's actually Rev Rod in this case, because I did serve churches in the United States and Canada for 17 years. And I've seen some of these changes. I'm retired now from that, and 22 years of teaching special education, mostly with minority. The issue that comes to my mind is, remember James Luther Adams? I know Finley, I know you will appreciate this as well. And Jack, definitely after that obscene language that was you quoted at that meeting, whatever happened to the loyal opposition? It's a great British term. It was a way of saying that there was loyalty, connection, and care and concern, and that yes, you could be opposed. It's possible, and still love each other.
You're not allowed to be. I'm being thrown out of the ministry because basically of my vocal support for treating Todd right. You are not allowed to question anymore if you're a minister.
Can I hear from Jack or Finley on this one? I'd love to.
Before I'm tired. The hearing was pretty intense, and just to let you know, I don't think I'll be thrown out yet. But here, real quick, I just want to make sure that Richard announces our April convocation coming up in April, and mentions the fact that if you're a minister and want to be a part of our religious professional task force, we'll be meeting the first Wednesday of every month, and we'd like to have all you freewheelers out there to be a part of it. Now, repeat your question, because you said many important points. So run it by me one more time, Brother Brown. What did you say?
I was actually talking about the James Luther Adams when talking about covenant. He referred in that British concept of the loyal opposition.
Yes.
So you can debate.
Yes.
You can debate, and that improves ideas.
And
Here's my response.
Yes.
As a Leninist, there is the other history of Lenin before he got involved in trying to transform a peasant country into a capitalist country. He said, no party can operate unless there's full debate and discussion before we make a decision, even the decision to do the insurrection in 1917. He believed in a concept called democratic centralism, where the voice of the minority had to be heard. But then he said this, now everybody's spoken, we voted, and he wasn't a democratic behavior. You who are the loyal opposition, prove us wrong by trying to make the thing work. And if it doesn't work, you get the credit for it. That's the energy. That's the energy for powerful movements, organizations like we're trying to build. Listen to what is being said. Look for the point of unity. What is the point of unity in the opposing point of view? If you achieve synergy, you're on your way. But you can't achieve synergy if you shit up the other side. So that's how I'm responding. Mm-hmm. So both Lenin and the JLA were on the same path with that, but the loyal opposition, wonderful term.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second. Finley asked me to tell people about our conference. UMIAC is having a conference on Saturday, April 9th, Central Time from 10 to 3. So that means Eastern Time, 11 to 4, and Pacific Time, noon to 5 or something. Several speakers, but the theme of the whole convocation is the eighth principle. And a notice has been sent to all church offices, or most church. There's some church offices that refuse to accept our mailings, but a majority of them do. Or you can also find it on the UMIAC homepage, right on the front page. Beverly.
Hi, I am Beverly Cease. I'm the minister at the Kokomo Fellowship in Indiana. And our congregation has decided to invite all the churches, all the UU churches in the whole state of Indiana to come together the third weekend of April and have opportunities for discussion and conversation and some explanation of some of these things that are going on. And so we hope to hear from folks from all over the state. And then my idea is that then if we come up with some sort of proposal or some ideas, that we can then take them to our regional assembly, which is 2 weeks later on April 30th. And then we can also take them to General Assembly in June in Portland. And so we are thinking that we need to get people from different churches together. Our districts were eliminated. This regional assembly is going to be 4 hours on Zoom. Our district meetings used to be a whole weekend. You know, how much is going to happen there? So we are inviting people to the Kokomo church for Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday morning service. And hoping that people will come and ask questions and just have an opportunity to talk and not be told that they don't get it. So we'll let you know how that goes in Indiana, and then maybe this needs to happen in some other states or areas.
Right on.
Thank
I'm
you.
signing off, y'all. Wonderful
Okay.
meeting, wonderful service. Love you, Jack. We got work to do.
Let me interrupt and correct myself. I was saying that our convocation on April 9th, Pacific time would be 8 to 1. I was going the wrong way. Wesley.
I am among those who had the benefit of being taught by JLA. And I remember him vividly and having organized the IVI in Chicago to bring a kind of a broad ranging opposition to the then dominance of Mayor Daley's and the earlier Democratic machine. I also remember his telling about arguing with a fellow at First Unitarian about race and why people should be admitted to First Unitarian, no matter what color they were, and staying up late arguing with this one guy. I think it was late anyway, and saying, and then he's saying, well, he turned to him and he said, well, what do you think the purpose of the church is? And the guy said, well, I guess it's to get a hold of people like me and change me. The other thing I recall about JLA, story that's appropriate to this because of authoritarianism, that he was on a Kruft traveling fellow. They gave him to go and study in Germany in the 30s, which was very dangerous. And his telling about how the Nazi students would, if their professor tried to speak in the slightest favor of democracy, would stamp their feet and stamp their feet continually so he couldn't be heard. And I'm afraid that's what reminds me of what's going on. It reminds me of the cancellation going on in people trying to speak their minds in the Ukraine, of of people standing up. Of course, I remember the anti-war demonstrations as well as the civil rights one. But here it is again. You may not do this. You get 15 years for reporting the news or for holding up a sign. And now we look at the UUA. Are we any better off? I mean, are we on the wrong side of the border in the case of the Ukraine? Where are we? And you may not speak, you create harm and so forth. But our heritage, I can't imagine. Of course, I think JLA would get up out of the grave if he could and tell us about it. Because there could be no one who was more against racism than he, unless perhaps, as he used to say, it was Mrs. Adams, who liked to hang her towel on the towel bar a little to the left of him. So anyway, that's all I have to say about JLA.
Yeah. Thank you. If I can tell one anecdote, I belong to a group called UU Ministers in New England. Okay, 250 UU ministers in New England. And I try to bring their attention to what UMIAC is doing. And I've been informed by the moderators, if I even mention UMIAC one more time, I'll be removed from the group. In other words, I'm basically silenced on the subject of UMIAC, even though I'm the chair of UMIAC. That's an example of what's going on.
What's their reason? What reason?
Because it's out of covenant with the UU policy. Out of covenant, that means heretical. It's of course bullshit.
So how do they define that?
They don't. They just say out of covenant. It's out of covenant.
Yeah.
Are we done for the night? Perhaps. Yeah. Thank you.
Good. It sure is nice to see everybody.
Hey, everyone. Good to see
Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that great sermon, Jack.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
And Kate, thanks for speaking up.
Yes. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Thanks, Richard.
Good night.
Bye,
Good night.
everybody.
Sweet dreams.